Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable lives and incredible resilience of medieval peasants, the everyday heroes who, despite the odds, managed to survive some of the coldest and most brutal nights in history. From makeshift insulation tricks to communal sleeping strategies, their story is one of grit, ingenuity, and determination. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of medieval life, you might imagine jousting knights, grand feasts, and merry fairs. But for the average peasant, winter was less about merriment and more about, how do we not die tonight? It wasn't just a season. It was a test of endurance that came around every year, like an especially cruel teacher who didn't believe in second chances. Picture this. You're living in a tiny mud and stick hut, with walls so thin you could probably hear a bird sneeze from outside. No insulation. No windows, unless you count a small hole stuffed with animal skin. And definitely no thermostat wars with your siblings. The inside temperature of your home was usually just a polite couple of degrees above whatever the weather was doing outside. If it was freezing outdoors, it was politely slightly less freezing inside. Congratulations. Nights were the worst. Darkness swallowed everything. The wind howled like an angry ghost, and the fire in the hearth sputtered pathetically, doing its best but mostly just roasting the toes of whoever was sitting closest. If you were on the other side of the room, sorry, you might as well have been camping outside, with worse snacks. Clothing wasn't much help either. Peasants didn't own fancy fur coats or goose-down blankets. You had a couple of rough-spun wool tunics, maybe a cloak that smelled suspiciously of goat, and a hope that layering them would turn you into some kind of human onion. Spoiler, it didn't really work. And forget about snuggling under soft quilts. Beds were often nothing more than sacks stuffed with hay or straw, maybe with a few old rushes thrown in for good measure. And bonus, some fleas for extra company. Luxury, thy name is medieval peasant life. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Frostbite, hypothermia, and general freezing to death were constant risks, especially for young children and the elderly. Every morning that you woke up still breathing was considered a minor miracle, and honestly, worth celebrating. Maybe with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. So yes, surviving a medieval winter wasn't about comfort. It was about gritting your teeth, piling on every piece of cloth you owned, huddling with your livestock, and praying you didn't wake up with icicles hanging off your eyebrows. And the real adventure? It was just beginning. If you think your apartment is drafty because the window doesn't close properly, medieval peasants would like a word. Their homes weren't just drafty. They were basically very enthusiastic wind tunnels with a roof. Most peasant houses were what historians politely call wattle and daub construction. Translation? Sticks crisscrossed like a giant basket, smeared with a charming mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. Yes, dung. They weren't trying to be gross. Dung was a cheap, sticky insulator. Plus, it was always readily available, shall we say. These walls, no matter how lovingly smeared, didn't stand much chance against a proper winter storm. The cold wind found every crack, every gap, and gleefully danced its way into the one-room homes, swirling around and making sure you never got too comfortable. Privacy? Absolutely not. Warmth? Not really. Character building? Definitely. And then there were the roofs. Thatched roofs looked picturesque, sure, but after a few months of rain and snow, they sagged, leaked, and occasionally let in the local wildlife. Nothing says pleasant evening like a squirrel dropping onto your dinner. Windows, if they existed at all, were laughably tiny and usually covered with thin animal hides or wooden shutters. Glass was so expensive that even the lord of the manor probably couldn't afford more than a single tiny pane. And peasants. They were just happy if the wind didn't rip the cowhide right off the wall mid-blizzard. To make matters worse, floors were often just compacted dirt. When it rained or snowed heavily, mud seeped up through the ground, so technically you could say they had indoor water features. Not that they appreciated it. In winter, every step inside your own home could feel like trudging across a frozen marsh. Cold from below, cold from above, cold from inside. It was a three-dimensional assault on your body heat. But medieval peasants weren't the type to whine. They packed gaps with moss, jammed old rags into the worst drafts, and huddled close to each other. Human insulation at its finest. Creativity, stubbornness, and a bit of sheep grease rubbed into the walls were often the only things standing between them and becoming medieval popsicles. Because if your house was falling apart, and your best protection against the elements involved mud and goat hair, well, at least you could laugh about it. Sort of. If your teeth weren't chattering too hard. As if the freezing air wasn't enough, medieval peasants also had to battle a silent enemy rising from below, the frozen ground itself. Floors weren't really floors back then. They were just slightly flatter patches of earth inside your home. Maybe if you were lucky, someone had thrown down some straw or old rushes to give you the illusion of comfort. But make no mistake, you were sleeping one insulted back away from the cold, hard dirt. And oh, that cold was relentless. It seeped up from the earth like an evil little ghost, worming its way through the straw into your bones and straight into your very soul. If you dropped anything onto the floor during a winter night, congratulations, it was now part of the permafrost. Medieval peasants tried to fight this grim battle in a few ways. One method was layering thick mats of straw across the floor. If you could afford it, or more realistically, if you could steal enough of it from your neighbour's field without getting caught, you might have a decent insulating barrier. But straw flattened fast, got mouldy even faster, and added an extra crunchy soundtrack to your already miserable nights. Some homes layered dried rushes onto the dirt instead. Every so often they would throw fresh rushes on top without cleaning out the old ones. Over time, this created a fascinating ecosystem of decomposing plants, fleas, and whatever mystery creatures decided to move in. It was basically medieval carpet padding. If your carpet was alive, slightly damp, and smelled like a wet dog. Beds, for those who had them, didn't solve much. They were usually little more than wooden frames packed with, you guessed it, more straw or hay. Instead of cosy mattresses, you had poking, shifting, crunchy layers that did little against the cold radiating from below. Tossing and turning wasn't about comfort. It was a desperate, awkward dance to keep blood flowing and avoid freezing one side of your body. The truth is, medieval peasants didn't conquer the icy ground so much as learn to live uncomfortably above it. A good night's sleep wasn't about dreams or softness. It was about waking up with all your toes still attached. And if you could pull that off, hey, you were doing better than most. If medieval homes had a single hero during winter, it wasn't the roof, or the walls, or even the brave layers of dirt and dung insulation. It was the hearth, a crackling, stubborn fire pit that served as the only real defence against the cold, the darkness, and the general gloom of medieval life. At the centre of nearly every peasant home was a simple fire. No fireplace with a fancy stone mantel, no neat chimney sweeping the smoke skyward. Instead, you had a basic pit or pile of stones, some half-burned logs, and enough smoke pouring into the room to make you wonder if you were slowly becoming a ham. That's right. Most homes didn't even have chimneys. Smoke just kind of did its best. It drifted out through small holes in the roof, cracks in the walls, or right into your lungs if it was feeling lazy that evening. It wasn't ideal for breathing, or your overall lifespan. But on the bright side, it did a great job of fumigating fleas and other unwanted guests. Who needs pest control when you're marinating in smoke 24/7? The hearth wasn't just about warmth either. It was the kitchen, the light source, and sometimes even the medieval version of a television. People sat around the fire telling stories, gossiping, or just staring into the flames because, frankly, there wasn't much else to do after sunset. Keeping the fire alive wasn't just a nice idea, it was mandatory. Letting the fire die out at night was like putting up a sign for the cold to come in and finish you off. Plus, reigniting a fire in winter wasn't as easy as striking a match. You had to work with flint, steel, kindling, and more prayers than you'd ever offered before. Everyone in the family had a duty, stoking the flames, watching the embers, adding peat, sticks, or if you were lucky, a precious piece of dry wood. It was a constant battle between human persistence and the smothering cold that wanted nothing more than to snuff you out. The hearth didn't guarantee survival, but without it, survival was downright impossible. It was a smoky, sputtering, often disappointing little fire. But in a medieval winter, it was the beating heart of hope. If there was one thing medieval peasants feared more than running out of ale, it was letting the fire go out overnight. Without that warm, flickering lifeline, the cold would creep in faster than a tax collector after harvest. And in the dead of winter, restarting a fire from scratch wasn't just inconvenient, it could be deadly. Matches didn't exist yet. Lighters? Dream on. Rekindling a fire meant striking flint and steel together, praying for a single precious spark, and then coddling that spark with tender love and whatever dry kindling you hadn't already burned days ago. Imagine trying to do all this in the freezing dark, half asleep with frozen fingers. Now add a hungry wolf howling in the distance for extra motivation. So peasants got smart. They banked the fire. No, not in a cozy savings account. Banking meant carefully burying the embers under a mound of ash right before bed. The ash acted like a blanket, insulating the glowing coals and keeping them alive, just barely, until morning. If you did it right, you could stroll over at sunrise, poke the pile a little, add fresh wood, and, voila, fire without the frostbite. But if you did it wrong? Well, let's just say mornings got a whole lot colder and a whole lot grumpier. Fire banking was an art, passed down from parent to child like a prized family recipe. Everyone had their own little secrets. Some said use dry ash only, others insisted a bit of dampness was key. Some packed the embers tight, others let them breathe. You could practically start a medieval argument just by suggesting a better fire banking method. It was the ancient version of arguing over barbecue techniques, just with slightly higher survival stakes. Sometimes banking the fire wasn't enough. A howling wind might sneak through a crack and snuff it out anyway, or a clumsy sheep might stumble into the hearth. Yes, it happened. That's why some families took turns getting up in the night to check the coals, basically the medieval equivalent of sleepwalking to the thermostat. In the end, fire banking was less about mastering nature and more about buying just a few more precious hours of warmth. And if you woke up to even a single surviving ember, that was your victory, right there, and enough to face another day of battling the cold. In medieval times, the phrase, "the more, the merrier," wasn't just about parties. It was a winter survival tactic. When the fire sputtered and the freezing winds whistled through every crack, there was one surefire source of warmth, each other. And if that meant sleeping cheek to cheek with your entire family, neighbours, livestock, and possibly a very confused goose, so be it. Forget about personal space. Privacy wasn't even a concept. On the coldest nights, the goal wasn't comfort. It was, don't wake up frozen to the floor. Entire households piled into the warmest corner of the house, wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth they could find, and formed what could best be described as a desperate, snoring, human lasagna. Younger kids squeezed in between parents, grandparents snuggled under the outer layers, and if Cousin Ethel showed up unexpectedly, well, there was always room for one more. If you were lucky, you got to sleep in the middle, where body heat radiated from all sides. If you were unlucky, you were on the edge, the medieval equivalent of sleeping next to the door of a meat locker. And woe to the person who moved too much during the night. You shift once to get comfortable, and suddenly you've knocked Aunt Maud into the freezing draft by the wall. Congratulations, you're now the family villain. Sometimes even bedding was shared. A communal straw mattress that slowly flattened under the nightly weight of multiple generations. And because hygiene wasn't exactly winning any awards back then, let's just say it wasn't the most fragrant sleeping arrangement. But hey, when it's you versus frostbite, you stop being picky. Body heat wasn't just nice, it was strategic. Some medieval guides even recommended deliberately arranging the strongest, warmest people on the outside of the group, like human shields against the cold. Babies and frail elders were tucked deep in the centre, treated like the precious little heat generators they were. This wasn't just about survival, though. Over time, it became part of daily life, part of family bonding. Long winter nights huddled together led to storytelling, singing, and undoubtedly some very interesting conversations muffled under a shared wool blanket. So next time your sibling steals your blanket or your dog hogs the bed, just remember, at least you're not fighting for elbow space between a snoring uncle and a particularly judgmental goat. If you thought modern roommates were a challenge, medieval peasants would like to introduce you to their winter housemates: cows, goats, pigs, chickens, basically anything with a pulse and a little bit of body heat. Bringing animals indoors wasn't just a quirky village tradition, it was vital for survival. Livestock generated warmth, and in a poorly insulated hovel where the wind howled louder than your stomach, every little degree mattered. Plus, if your goat shared a wall with you, it was slightly less likely to get stolen by a neighbour in the dead of night. 2 birds, 1 stinky stone. At night, the house became a chaotic living furnace. Chickens nested in corners, pigs snorted near the hearth, and cows lounged luxuriously against the walls, chewing cud like they paid rent. It wasn't glamorous, far from it. If you've ever been stuck in a car on a summer road trip with someone who forgot to shower, imagine that. But it's a cow, it's winter, and there's literally nowhere else to go. The smells? Legendary. By springtime, the perfume of a shared winter was something fierce. You didn't need to light a candle. Your nostrils were already on a wild ride. But medieval peasants developed a selective nose. They didn't complain much because they knew one uncomfortable truth. The more animals inside, the fewer frozen toes in the morning. Certain animals even had prime spots. Cows, being the biggest and warmest, usually took centre stage near the family. Goats were allowed closer in for their warmth, and because goats, being goats, would find a way inside anyway. Chickens roosted in rafters or old baskets, and pigs, well, pigs didn't care. They plopped down wherever they pleased, probably right in the middle of the floor. Of course, sharing your bedroom with livestock wasn't without hazards. Imagine drifting off peacefully, only to be rudely awakened by a chicken deciding your hair makes a good perch, or stepping barefoot into something suspicious. First thing in the morning. Yes, medieval mornings could be full of surprises. Still, despite the noise, the smells, and the occasional hoof to the ribs, peasants understood the simple math. Cold kills, and cows cuddle, whether they want to or not. In the battle against winter's icy fingers, a warm, slightly slobbery cow breath was often the deciding factor between life and death. In medieval winters, fashion wasn't about looking good, it was about not dying. Peasants weren't flipping through the latest trends, they were layering up like they were preparing for battle against the Grim Reaper himself. The rule was simple. If you owned it, you wore it. Sometimes, all at once. First, the basic undertunic, a scratchy, probably not too clean linen shirt. Over that, a thicker woolen tunic, then another, if you had it. Add some leggings that sagged at the knees, a rough cloak draped over your shoulders, and, if you were really lucky, a patched-up sheepskin thrown on top like a prize trophy. Congratulations, you were now approximately 10% warmer and 90% itchier. Boots were a luxury. Many peasants wrapped their feet in layers of cloth or old rags and stuffed them into wooden clogs. If the cold still bit through, well, you just added another rag and hoped you didn't lose a toe. And forget about washing all these layers. Washing your clothes in the middle of winter meant dragging them to a frozen stream, smashing through the ice, and then waiting 2 days for your only shirt to dry. If it didn't just freeze into a tragic shirt cycle. Most peasants wisely decided that smelling like a mix of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price to pay for not freezing solid. Interestingly, the dirt and grease buildup had a bonus feature: insulation. That grimy layer locked in body heat. It was like a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, just smellier and far less socially acceptable today. Hats, scarves, and gloves were prized treasures. A simple woolen cap could mean the difference between making it through the night or waking up with hair frozen to the wall. Gloves were often homemade from whatever scraps of leather or fabric people could scrounge, sometimes looking more like sad puppet costumes than anything fashionable. Children were especially swaddled until they resembled overstuffed turnips, waddling awkwardly around the house. The goal was to trap as much precious body heat as possible. Style? Elegance? Never heard of them. Warmth was the real medieval flex. So, the next time you complain about layering up for a chilly day, just remember, medieval peasants walked around wearing half their wardrobe at once, looking like lumpy laundry bags, and counting themselves lucky for it. In the medieval peasant playbook, dirt wasn't just something you scrubbed off. It was practically a survival tool. As it turns out, getting grimy wasn't a sign you'd given up on life. It was tactical, strategic, dare we say, genius. See, winter posed a very specific problem: heat loss. Clean clothes, especially freshly laundered linen, were surprisingly terrible at keeping you warm. They were breathable, sure, but when the air temperature hovered somewhere between hypothermia and instant regret, breathable wasn't exactly a selling point. That's where dirt came in. As peasants trudged through day after day without washing their clothing, layers of grime, natural body oils, and good old-fashioned mud began to build up on their tunics, cloaks, and leggings. Over time, this natural armour clogged the tiny gaps in the fabric, making clothes more wind-resistant. It was like medieval weatherproofing, just smellier. Sure, you smelled like a goat who lost a bet, but guess what? You were warm. In fact, some medieval folks believed that washing yourself too often in winter could actually make you sick. Better to keep that protective, holy filth barrier intact. Bathing was rare, laundry even rarer, and soap, when it existed, was reserved for serious occasions, like when the bishop showed up, or maybe right before you died. Adding to the strategy, peasants layered their clothes without changing the ones underneath. You just threw your new layer on top of last month's. Eventually, you became a walking museum of the past 6 weeks. Every stain telling the heroic story of that one time I slipped in the mud but didn't die. To outside observers, medieval peasants might have looked and smelled like they had completely given up on hygiene. But the peasants knew better. That grimy, crusty tunic was a thermal shield against death by frostbite. It wasn't glamorous, but neither was freezing to death because you wanted to smell like flowers. Besides, in a world where literally everyone stank to high heaven, you weren't offending anyone. Nose blindness was practically a way of life. So yes, in medieval winters, filth wasn't failure. It was fashion. It was function. And if you had a thick, greasy outer layer by February, you, my friend, were winning at life. If you thought medieval peasants spent their winters tucked into plush feather beds with embroidered quilts, think again. The reality was a bit more rustic. And by rustic, I mean, let's sleep on a pile of dead plants and hope for the best. Beds, in the medieval peasant world, were usually a rough wooden frame, if you could afford one, covered with a big sack stuffed full of straw, hay, or old rushes. That's it. No memory foam, no orthopedic support, no 5-star hotel experience. Just a crunchy, lumpy, slightly pokey mess that smelled faintly of barnyard and regret. Every toss and turn in the night brought a delightful soundtrack of crinkling straw and the occasional sharp jab from a rogue stalk. Some peasants even skipped the wooden frame altogether and just threw the straw straight onto the dirt floor, creating a luxurious, ground-level sleeping experience that modern influencers would probably rebrand as earth-connected slumber. The straw mattresses weren't just uncomfortable, they were temporary. Over time, the straw flattened, grew mouldy, attracted bugs,